Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Sam Martin, and I'm a restoration ecologist with the Ecostudies Institute. I'm going to be presenting about a project that we've been working on Jones Island in the San Juans for the past 5 years. I've been working, this is a project in cooperation with Washington State Parks, and also just wanted to acknowledge my coworker Adam Martin, my long lost cousin. There's a lot of Martins out there, who's based in Olympia, and we've been working on this project together. So he's here at the workshop as well. Anyway, so yeah, I'm gonna be discussing the restoration of Gary Oak Douglas-fir woodland and rocky bald habitat on Jones Island using prescribed fire and direct seeding. Next slide, please. So to give you a little geographical context of where Jones is located, in case you're unfamiliar, it's sort of right in the middle of the San Juan Islands. It's a relatively small island, as you can see, compared to the bigger islands like San Juan and Orcas, where I live. And it's currently owned by Washington State Parks, but is, of course, the traditional lands of the Coast Salish people. It's just under 200 acres and accessible only by boat. And it also, the boat access can be a little tricky because there's only a seasonal dock. With the currents and storms out here in the winter, State Parks actually removes the main dock during the off season. So anyway, you can see that most of Jones is covered in conifer forests. And about 6 years ago, my colleagues at Ecostudies did ecological assessments of the island for parks, and highlighted these sort of remnant Gary Oak communities, and recommended that they do some more active restoration to keep the oaks alive. So that's really where the initial objective came from, was to basically thin out a lot of the conifers that had grown into the rocky bald habitats due to a lack of fire. So we'll be looking at that sort of northwest corner of the island. Next slide, please. So to give you an idea of like what a typical rocky bald looks like, that's sort of what we call meadows in the islands, rocky balds. I know somebody asked about the difference. We have a lot of varied topography up here. It's very rocky, obviously very shallow soils. We don't really have that many remnant prairies anymore. So this is just a snapshot of a rocky bald on Jones. You can see the Gary Oak is there, and a pretty thick cover of moss, as well as a pretty homogeneous understory of grasses. I would think half of those are non-native. So one of our objectives was to actually, use fire to burn off the moss to allow seeds to have access to the soil and germinate. But this area hadn't been burned in, probably over 100 years. And to create some of that diversity that Mackenzie was talking about, just because these habitats can be so incredibly diverse for pollinators, and there's a myriad of species that can grow here. So that was also part of our objective, was to restore the understory. Next slide, please. So speaking of native plant diversity, really on Jones, there's a one of the biggest challenges is an overabundance of deer, and that's something we run into in the islands all over the place. But Jones is typically worse than other islands, so poses a greater challenge, and state parks is pretty limited in what they can do in terms of deer population control at this point in time. So some of our native species are really just hanging on the edge of the shoreline environments. You can see that this is our native prickly pear, which is blooming, which is quite a treat to see, as well as Pacific gumweed, which can grow just right out of the rocks. So those are hardy species that have hung on without the disturbance and other restoration efforts. Next. This is a little glimpse of sort of the impacts of deer herbivory. We've done a lot of work on the islands. I've only seen a few flowering shrubs left, and this one is only has persevered because it's out of reach of the deer. Next. So in 2019, State Parks wanted to try a controlled burn in the Gary Oak habitat, thinking these are fire adapted ecosystems, and so the objective again was to restore sort of the structure of the Gary Oak, and they had been doing some girdling of the Douglas-fir with the help of the WCC. a year or two before that, and had cleared out some of the Douglas-firs. So this was just going to be a ground, a low intensity ground fire moving around the trees. And we highlighted about 3 acres to burn. And again, like that's not a very big area, but when you think about follow-up activities and weed control and seeding, it is actually quite a large area. And you can see that just the logistics of burning on an island are definitely something. State parks set up the hose lay around the edges of the burn, excuse me. And because of the location, we could only really use salt water. So salt water was pumped from the boats up around the 3 acres with additional hoses for, controlling the fire if needed. Next. So we began the burn at the top of the hill, so sort of a rocky ball that, from the shoreline is pretty open and then is more wooded as you go uphill. You can see it's a little shady. And to my great surprise, we really couldn't get this upper area to burn. It was in late September. You'd think end of summer would light just fine. But yeah, we, because of the thick moss, and it had rained a couple weeks before that, we had probably 3 people with drip torches, and we really couldn't get this area to light. It burned in patches, but we eventually had to sort of leave it and head downhill where there was more open, sunny conditions. So even within 1 3-acre site, we had an incredibly diverse array of site conditions to work with. Next. This is sort of the center part of the project area. Again, 3 acres. This was head of state parks, Chris Giudotti. And you can see it was sort of a low intensity ground fire, went pretty smoothly. It was incredibly smoky. So if you're ever thinking about burning a site that hasn't burned in a long time and has a thick, accumulation of duff and moss, it's going to create like incredibly smoky conditions. And one of my coworkers, Molly, who's done dozens, if not hundreds of burns in the South Sound, said it was the smokiest fire she had ever worked on. It was quite something. So that's just something to keep in mind. Next. If you're wanting to protect some tree species from the fire, you can spray the perimeter with water. So that's what we did here with this juniper. State parks wanted to protect it. And so we just sprayed the area and it worked pretty well. So, with just a little bit of water, and the fire went right around it. Next. This was the crew on that day in September. So it was a combination of the Ecostudies staff, which was at that time still part of the Center for Natural Lands Management. So kind of same people, different name. DNR came out to help with the burn, Orcas Fire and Rescue, and Washington State Park staff. So it was quite a concerted effort. We had lots of people, very, well managed, and lots of hands on deck. And luckily, it all went very smoothly. Okay, next slide, please. So we went out to the site a month later just to look at the effects of the fire, and this is how the site looked. It was a pretty, the fire reached a lot of the area. You can tell it's a little bit patchy. Some areas didn't burn, which is sort of what we expected because of the variable topography. There's the next slide, sort of a similar view looking uphill. And you can also see some trees that were girdled by WCC. So there were some standing dead trees, but really not a lot of ladder fuel at all. So it wasn't, much of a concern that this would go into the crown of the trees. So anyway, a lot of open area for seeding, which we did next. So the next slide shows the seed that we brought to the site. And we tend to aim for about 8 to 10 pounds of seed per acre, but it really depends on the site. This was a little bit more patchy, but I think we did have about, 20 pounds of seed, mostly grass. But before we seeded, we did treat the regrowth with 1 application of glyphosate to just, the hope was to decrease the presence of rootgut brome that had been, across the site, and it was resprouting after the fire, and other non-native species to really clear the decks to get our native seed in soil, in contact with the soil, and give it a little head start to establish. Next. Well, the next spring we went out. This was probably April, I believe. So 6 or 7 months after the the burn and after seeding, and we were just so pleased. There was native fescue establishment just really across the site. You can see that bluish bunch grass is our native fescue. We did roamers and red fescue. And, you know, we're kind of patting ourselves on the back and it looked really promising. But the site had not gone through a summer yet. And as a lot of us know, restoration projects aren't always a linear endeavor. And we did run into some real challenges because of hot, dry summer conditions overlaid with deer herbivory. So next slide. But to keep on the positive note for now, one of our, you know, it's always interesting after a burn what species might respond. And sometimes it's those that you didn't seed or didn't see before very much that just kind of just really benefit from the fire. And one of those was this species of monkey flower that grows amongst the rocky balds in the islands. And it just went, it really went crazy. And it was just yellow across the rocky bald that spring. Next slide, please. So again, back to the idea of, you know, within each site, especially in these rocky balds, there's just so many different microsite conditions. So you can do the same method across the site, but get really different results. And that was definitely a lesson we learned here. So this is sort of in the middle bench of the project area, the little bit of shade from the firs, sort of a more woodland structure and deeper soil. And the fescue just established really well. Almost, we might have overseeded it a little bit. It's quite dense, and then the death camas in the foreground really responded well. I mean, it was there before, but it definitely just responded very well to the burning. Next slide, please. One interesting thing that we learned from this project is that even though we seeded across the site with this mix of 12 forbs and grasses, we found a really distinct pattern of the seeds becoming established at the base of the rocks. And that's really informed ongoing projects if we're seeding, because, you know, sometimes forb seed, it's you know, it's expensive. It's, you know, you want to be really intentional about where you're seeding it. We've tended to focus our forb seeding at the base of rocks if we're dealing with these sort of environments. So here you can see there's a mixture of yarrow and buttercup, sea blush, native chickweed, there's Oregon sunshine, tiny little true baby stars. So, you know, again, that first spring, the germination was really, the plants did really well, and specifically at the base of rocks. Next slide, please. One thing we're trying at the site, again, because of the deer pressure, is the use of these, you know, call them sort of natural deer exclosures. I usually was of the mind that we should clear all woody debris from these, you know, meadows and rocky balds as a fire would do. But the more Adam and I have done plant surveys across the island, we would find, you know, one chocolate lily under a branch and sort of protected from deer. So we're just kind of playing around with this idea of using debris on site to see if we can deter deer from certain areas. And again, like at the base of the rock, there's a lot of vegetation or germination. And so at this point, it seems to be working well. We'll see, you know, as the years go by, how that works. Next slide, please. One unexpected effect of the fire that I wanted to mention was that we did have some unexpected Douglas-fir mortality. You know, usually these tree species are quite fire adapted, thick bark, but in the burn area, there were quite a few large Doug-fir that have since died since the 2019 burn. And so part of that, you know, we don't exactly know which was the the main factor, but it could have been a combination of, you know, a hot late summer burn on shallow soils. You can see the roots here, they just can't root very deeply because of the rockiness. And so perhaps they were more exposed to the fire, and a thick moss and thatch buildup could have made it hotter than like a historical fire of that was, you know, more frequent. Again, we also had to use salt water, and there were some areas that, you know, were like there was sap on the trees, so we had to use more water, and that might have been kind of a 1-2 punch for these trees. So not necessarily a bad thing when we're trying to restore oak, you know, the oak trees and really giving them more light, especially considering the island as a whole is pretty, it's got a lot of conifer cover. But they do offer some microsite conditions. And again, if it's just something to keep in mind that could be an unexpected result when an area hasn't burned very, very, in recent memory. So next slide, please. So another, challenge that we've had post burning is that area that I showed you that had really great fescue establishment that first spring has slowly been inundated with non-native grasses. So, anybody who's worked in grasslands, this is one of our biggest challenges. And even though uphill with a little deeper soil, little shade, fescue is doing great. And these really harsh west-facing dry slopes, it's been a real challenge. You can just see a few fescue there among the Vulpia. That's a species we're dealing with across the region with prairie restoration. It could be due to climate change, hotter, drier summers, or just, the fescue's having a hard time getting through the summer. We're also dealing obviously with deer herbivory here, and it's a state park, so people are bringing seeds on their shoes all the time. So this has been definitely a challenge we've been dealing with at the site. Next slide, please. So to look at the comparison, we have spring 2020, right after the fire, a lot of fescue establishment, and then 2022, more Vulpia has moved into that area. But in the deer exclosures, the native plants are doing quite well. Okay, next slide. So to deal with this Vulpia taking over some of the areas, we decided to do smaller patch burns this time and use fire again as a tool, but on a smaller scale, so we could revisit these areas and really focus our efforts in the hopes of creating like forb islands within the restoration spot. So this was definitely a lesson learned. Maybe start small so you can keep up with, getting your natives established and keeping the invasives out. So this was September 2022. Next slide, please. Again, DNR came and helped out. We did about 6 patch burns. I think each one was, 1/8 of an acre or less, fairly small. All went pretty well, just surface grass fires. Next. And sometimes I just wanted to mention that fire is like a really exciting tool. It's kind of sexy. It's like, people want to bring fire back, but it's really not a tool to use generally on its own. It often needs some follow-up treatment, especially if you have invasives on site. So we went back and we're experimenting with 2 different herbicide treatments in these patch burns, as well as seeding. And we'll be monitoring them again this spring. Next slide. This is another small patch burn that was done on that day. This is, our burn boss putting out some smoldering fire at the end of the day. Next. We returned to that site the following spring. Again, the death camas is doing really well. Unfortunately, this is not a great place for harvesting camas. Death camas really does dominate, and I think that's basically driven by the overabundance of deer. That's one thing that they will not eat. Next slide. So, 4 or 5 years later, we're doing pretty well in the deer exclosures, but dealing with a lot of invasive grasses still around these protected areas. And I'll just give you a little snapshot inside the deer exclosure. The next slide. You can see there's just kind of an abundance of Oregon sunshine, sea blush, chickweed, and other species growing. So it's a little bittersweet. We can see what could grow if it's protected. And hopefully these will act as a seed source that can expand, over time, potentially. Okay, next slide. So just to quickly review lessons learned, be clear about your objective when you're using fire. It usually alone is not the answer, depending on what non-native species you have on the site. Late summer burns may cause additional tree mortality because they're hotter, and we're kind of considering more spring burns and experimenting with that. Harsh sites are hard. They're hot and dry and getting hotter. And then to focus understory restoration efforts where deer herbivory is not as extreme. So I think that's it, and happy to take some questions.
Great. Thanks, Samantha. That was great. Yeah, we have time for a couple questions before lunch. Have you looked at seed loss, lack of establishment as a result of small mammal and bird populations on Jones? Will this affect future seeding rates moving forward?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. We haven't really looked at that, I have to say, and part of that is it's a tricky site to get to, and so needing boat transportation and needing a landing craft if the dock is out, it's not an area we can go to very frequently. You know, voles are a big presence out here. We haven't seen a ton of vole activity on Jones, although sometimes they help seed establishment as well. Um, and you know, birds could be eating some of the seed for sure, I think, but what we're seeing is a lot of plants would get established but then die off in that first summer.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Also, someone asks, were these sites surveyed for rare non-vascular species?
That is a
Sure.
good question.
Good question.
You know, maybe I don't know if Adam is on the call, if he might want to pipe in, but I know before I got to Ecostudies, my coworkers did ecological assessments, so basically of you know, sort of just cataloging what species were there in these certain areas. And I'm not exactly sure. Washington State Parks might also have some plant inventory work that they've done.
Okay.
But yeah.
Was Jones Island historically a prairie? Do you know?
Hmm.
Not sure.
Well, I think when you look at the aerial photos, like from the 30s across the islands, you know, there were far fewer trees. Some south-facing slopes had, you know, 3 trees per acre. So I think there was a spectrum of open areas, woodlands. I think we had a lot of woodlands across the islands. You can see in the old growth, widely spaced trees with fire scars. So I think it was, you know, a combination of open areas, but definitely much more open than what we experience now due to lack of fire.
Okay. Getting a lot of questions in here. I don't know if we'll get to them all. Maybe you can answer a few on your own, but someone asks, what moss species were dominant in the burn site?
Hmm.
Do you have any idea?
Again, that would be a question for Adam. He's sort of our plant expert on the team. So yeah, I think there were 2 dominant ones. Again, we have that information in our pre-treatment data, so I'd be happy to look back at that. I'm just not thinking of the names. And it you know, was a lot of discussion about, you know, is it okay to burn moss? But again, zooming out, this was a 3-acre part of 200 acres, you know, island, and we felt like the benefit to actually getting new seeds established outweighed the risk of, you know, losing some moss, which is what historical fire would have done anyway.
Okay, one more question. Are you allowing madrona to remain on the site? As it is a declining tree species, someone's asking.
You know,
Did
within this
madrona
3-acre
come up?
unit, there weren't a lot of madronas. I think if there were, we would have sprayed around the base. There's really a lack of madrona. It's mostly Gary oak and Doug-fir. If there are madronas along the perimeter, I know that they have been left for sure. Like no madronas have been cut. So, and you know, sort of the objective of having a more diverse forest. I think Washington State Parks is leaving madronas. Yeah.